Tarzan is a child of Africa. He's an adopted son of Africa. He belongs to Africa. He's made by Africa.
You are Tarzan, Lord of the Apes, king of the jungle. Tarzan, Tarzan.
Tarzan is an incredibly intelligent, sensitive human being.
I remember when I was a kid, I used to yodel in the picnics on Sunday, you know. So I said, I know a yodel.
Burroughs does reference Tarzan as being godlike. He's very much like an Apollo figure. He's like the sun god, he's the gorilla god, he's the Africa god.
Edgar Rice Burroughs' novel Tarzan of the Apes was first published over 100 years ago in 1912. The novel was an overnight sensation and launched Burroughs' career as a highly successful writer of action, adventure, and science fiction stories. Tarzan was to become one of the best-known literary creations of the 20th century. Burroughs went on to write another 23 Tarzan novels. Tarzan of the Apes is second only to Dracula in terms of the number of film adaptations of a literary work. The Tarzan novels have appeared in over 50 languages and been adapted throughout the world for radio, television, comics and graphic novels, video games, animation, and for the stage.
The fact that he was raised in the jungle, the fact that he's not the typical superhero. He's human. He's strong, but he can get wounded. He's not flying through the air. He's not, he can't attach himself to buildings. He's just a person.
This man who comes from nature truly becomes a hero specifically because, unlike others, he can jump from tree to tree, be very close to apes, and communicate to the central question regarding Tarzan. Where did Burroughs get that idea in the first place?
Surprisingly, Burroughs never visited Africa, and his version of Africa, like most of the film versions of Tarzan, is an entirely imagined one. We know that Burroughs read contemporary colonial accounts of guerrillas and cannibals and exploration in Africa, but Burroughs was undoubtedly drawing on older archetypal myths and legends of children raised in the wild by animals. Rudyard Kipling's popular tale The Jungle Book, published some 20 years earlier, was undoubtedly a source of inspiration.
They call it the Dark Continent, Africa, where death wears a bright mantle, where beauty has fangs. Ancient, mysterious, terrible is the lore of Africa.
Well, it was 1912. Africa was kind of not newly discovered, but newly on Americans' minds. The southern migration had taken place, so that Americans of African descent were making their way into the North and creating more curiosity with somewhat less bigotry than they had encountered in the South. So there was kind of a vogue for discovery about Africa.
The general public had very little knowledge of what was going on in the real Africa in terms of the colonisation of Africa and the way in which the European colonisers were, in many cases, enslaving mission, the idea that we would go into Africa and we would civilise the peoples there by educating them, by teaching them Christianity and bringing the spoils of civilization to the Dark Continent.
Europeans couldn't have invented Tarzan, given the colonial context prevailing in the early 1900s. But Americans were completely free of this context. They may be imperialists, but they're not colonialists. These are two different things. In the early 20th century, unlike the French, English, Germans or Belgians, they didn't want a piece of Africa. This wasn't their concern. They preferred isolationism, remaining apart from the outside world, in order to build their own identity. I think Burroughs, as an author, perfectly reflected a society that didn't need to legitimate its presence in Africa.
Burroughs had a very significant experience being in the 7th Cavalry Regiment. He met older veteran soldiers who had fought wars against Native American tribes, and he was absolutely horrified by their racism. The white man's arrogance towards indigenous people was revolting to him. Back then, no one questioned the legitimacy of destroying the culture of early civilizations.
Africa was no longer the dark unknown continent, but that was still the coding that would go on. So if you want to set a fantastic adventure somewhere, Africa's a great place for it.
Well, Burroughs gets a bad rap sometimes. He never visited Africa. His Tarzan's Africa is totally a fantasy Africa. He also read the local travelogues, Stanley's In Darkest Africa, and he studied up on what everyone knew about gorillas and cannibals, and the knowledge wasn't perfect, but it was what they knew about Africa at the time.
Right after Roosevelt stepped out of his role as a president in 1909, he went to Africa with his son Kermit, who acted as a photographer for him, and a whole crew of naturalists and taxidermists. And he went for the Smithsonian Museum to kill some specimens and bring them back. What really contributed to sell this image of Africa as a massive playground for white men to exercise their masculinity was he wrote African Game Trails, which became very popular, in which he describes his activity as a hunter in Africa.
Roosevelt's popular book, African Game Trails, associated the image of the traditional Wild West frontier cowboy with the idea of hunting in the wilds of Africa.
You get the establishment of the Hall of Mammals in the American Museum of Natural History. You get the discovery of King Tut's tomb. And all of that is kind of feeding an interest in Africa as the place of the exotic.
A lot of the stuff Burroughs wrote, no one had done anything quite like that before. There was the dime novels, adventure stories, there was Jules Verne, science fiction, but Burroughs infused this heroic element to it.
Burroughs sent the manuscript in to the editor, Thomas Newell Metcalf of All Story magazine, and Metcalf loved it. He read it in one sitting. He passed it to his editors. They all read it. Rather than serialize it, they wanted to deliver this to the public in one deluxe issue in October 1912. The response was immediate. All sorts of fan letters, people loved it. They wanted to see more by this author. The newspapers picked up the story. Tarzan began to be serialized in newspapers all over the country. So it had a tremendous cultural impact immediately. Writing fiction was sort of his last desperate gambit. He was reading the pulp magazines and he said, you know, I can write stories as good as this.
Tarzan was born in the jungle after a shipwreck. So is I saying, these apes, this is not your family. Your family, and he shows him the locket, and he says, this is your family. He doesn't get it.
His self-image was that he was an inferior ape, a small, puny, weakling ape. And it wasn't until he's looking in the jungle stream and he sees himself next to an ape and realizes the vast difference. And then it was just a few years later that he discovered the books in his father's cabin, picture books, and saw a human next to an ape and realized, oh, I'm something different, I'm something superior. It was a light of knowledge awakening in him. And Burroughs sort of tracked the current thinking on evolution in that this was the great intellectual awakening that Tarzan had as a child, realizing I'm a man.
The first man Tarzan encounters is an archer. He gets the feeling that this man's humanity lies in the fact that he's wearing a loincloth, unlike himself, since Tarzan is actually naked. He's naked until he meets this other human being. who is the first character to show a sense of modesty, at least of human modesty. He understands that this loincloth has a strong humanizing function, and so later he takes great pride in stealing it and putting it on. He becomes human from the moment he wears underpants.
When the first novel, Tarzan of the Apes, came out in book form in 1914, Burroughs immediately wanted to submit this to movie producers. And a lot of producers felt like it was unfilmable. Here's a guy in hand-to-hand combat with apes, with lions. How are you going to film that? And finally, in 1917, William Parsons, an insurance salesman, decided that he could do it. Tarzan of the Apes was one of the first 6 silent films to earn over $1 million. Tarzan was a groundbreaker on the screen. They found ingenious ways to create ape costumes. The sort of costumes that we saw with Rick Baker in Greystoke, they had similar things in 1918. They had prosthetic appliances where the apes could move their jaws. They would get lion trainers who had lions they had raised and wrestled with to double for Tarzan. They had chimpanzees, they had vine swinging, and would get athletes to do the arboreal stuff, swinging through the trees. It was a challenge to put this on screen, but Hollywood rose to the occasion. They hired Elmo, who was an experienced actor, was part of D.W. Griffith's stock company. Elmo was big, he was chunky, he had a 53-inch chest, he played blacksmiths and the big brawny guy who just wades into a fight and punches it out. Elmo did really quite well because he wasn't a heavily trained actor. He has this sort of incredulousness to the whole thing, sort of like, I can't believe I'm here, which works well in some of the scenes and the romance with Jane.
This film stands out in that it's very faithful to the novel. To the best of my knowledge, Burroughs never said anything negative about the 1918 film, which I think he liked. However, he was very critical of the MGM films.
Once Tarzan became incredibly popular, Burroughs demonstrated great financial acumen, and in 1923, he incorporated himself as Edgar Rice Burroughs, Inc., which had never been done before by an American novelist. He also trademarked the word Tarzan, which enabled the company to exploit the character in a wide-ranging merchandising campaign that included Tarzan bread, Tarzan ice cream, Tarzan swimsuits, Tarzan gasoline, toys, games, and puzzles. Similarly, when radio became popular in the 1930s, Burroughs had Tarzan dramatized for radio, where the roles of Tarzan and Jane were played by his daughter and son-in-law Jim Pierce, who had also played Tarzan on screen. But possibly one of the most enduring and commercially successful spin-offs of Tarzan was his debut in comics in 1929, where the art form was in its infancy.
Burroughs and Tarzan were hugely successful, you know, Harry Potter of that era, so to speak. And so going into comics was logical. So they hired Hal Foster to draw the first Edgar Rice Burroughs Tarzan of the Apes novel, an adaptation of the novel in the format of a black and white daily newspaper strip. And he was such a brilliant artist, it just knocked everybody out. A couple years later, in '31, they decided to launch Tarzan as a full-page newspaper comic. And the newspapers were big back then. And it's important that in the newspaper strip, Tarzan retained the personality that Edgar Rice Burroughs had given him. He was intelligent, articulate, spoke many languages. He'd been to Europe, he'd been to America, he was married, although she wasn't in the strip hardly ever. They brought Hal Foster in to do it, and that really invented heroic comics, the superheroes, the Marvel comics, the stuff you see in the movies today. A lot of that can be traced back to Hal Foster drawing Tarzan in the early 30s. It was the depths of the Depression, and here is this escape into this incredibly beautifully drawn, beautifully colored, high-octane action
Foster, my favorite artist of all time, of any kind. His figures represented the ideal. They were noble figures and realistic but idealized backgrounds and castles, and just gorgeous to look like. His line was smooth and fluid, whereas Burns was agitated. I mean, it was two completely different styles.
They were looking for an artist to replace Hal Foster. They found this young artist, Burn Hogarth, and he was hired to try and be another Hal Foster. So Burns' own style was suppressed a little bit when he first took over the strip. Those early Burn Hogarth strips, they're really fun. He just went to town and did this wild stuff that was hugely popular. In my opinion, if you look stylistically at Burn Hogarth's comics, you can see his influence on the DC comic book superheroes of the 60s.
Burns' jungle and figures were always a bit more tortured than the Hal Foster. There was more tension and movement in them. It was sort of a frantic background, and figures were always, the fingers are always like this. So it was an interesting style, and a style very much that was Hogarth's.
At the time, Burn Hogarth was still rather unknown. Tarzan made him famous, but he also made Tarzan famous because he's arguably the most outstanding Tarzan artist out there. His style was very dynamic, which is visible in the way he draws the bodies and the richly detailed backgrounds, for instance. Even without knowing his name, if you've ever seen a panel from the Tarzan comics whose art, dynamism and aesthetics impressed you, then it was most probably Burn Hogarth's work.
And when MGM came calling and wanted to do the film, Burroughs said, fine, you can have the character, but I'm not going to give you any of the novels. MGM had to come up with their own story. And of course, they had the greatest talent in the world at that time. They came up with an entirely different approach, and it worked. It worked as well or better than Tarzan's novels. It certainly reached a bigger audience. Tarzan the Ape Man was a big-budget MGM film that was geared to all audiences.
He's coming up underneath you! He's going under your raft! Watch out, folks!
King Kong raised the bar for adventure films in 1933.
Wild, weird, wonderful, the stuff for which movies were made. Adventure, to make you wonder if it's true, while your eyes convince you that it is. Truly, the thrill of thrills.
So when they were filming Tarzan and his mate, they realized we really have to hit on all cylinders across all quadrants of appeal. Danger, violence, sexuality.
Love, mine.
Mine? Wife. My wife.
Tarzan.
They used every trick in the book to sort of up the action and the excitement, and it was compared to the Circus Maximus. Critics said, don't bring your kids to the final act where there are lions attacking elephants and humans and elephants battling lions. It's just a huge, violent brawl in the jungle, and we'll never see that kind of thing again. But it was very compelling.
The MGM films are very beautiful and poetic, with big studio sets, but completely inaccurate. And realism was very important to Burroughs. He understood the difference between film and literature. Film can't pretend. In the movies, a plastic plant is made of plastic, and a cardboard tree is made of cardboard. The fabricated nature of things is very apparent. Film can't cheat like literature does because film images are by definition photographic.
The introduction of Jane in the movie, any movie, is, it's like, you're like, it's on now.
Tarzan, what am I doing here? Alone? With you? Perhaps I better not think too much about that.
Johnny Weissmuller and Maureen O'Sullivan, just for whatever reason, they struck gold with him. It was a magical casting. Johnny was not a trained actor, and so he wasn't someone who overthought the role.
Jane. You can't get around me like that.
Maureen was a good physical complement. Johnny was 6'3", she was 5'3", she was tiny, very cultured, very girlish.
Yes. There's quite a difference, isn't there? Do you like that difference? You've never seen anyone like me before, have you?
So they just had the perfect chemistry. It's just one of those things like life
is true love, and he finds his reason for living. Tarzan loves Jane. That's where Tarzan becomes a man. Is when she's what tips him over.
I don't think you better look at me like that. Far too attractive. I love saying things to a man who can't understand. He doesn't even know what kisses are.
Love it.
I dare say you would.
Looking back at all those older Tarzan movies, especially the earlier ones, there's a sensuality about Tarzan and Jane. There was a sexiness about it, which, in their sort of natural state, it felt kind of liberating and beautiful.
When you think about it, when Tarzan came out in the 1920s or 30s, it was a form of eroticization of the wild life. It featured the first wild white people. Both Tarzan and Jane are white, who lived in the heart of the humid and unspoiled tropical forest.
A clip of Tarzan and Jane swimming underwater with their clothes off. And I think that that kind of naked sexuality is a...
Tarzan is Jane's love, Uwani, like the stars over the night, like the air to breathe. Tarzan makes me alive. Stop it!
Tarzan happy.
MGM cast Tarzan in this sort of dumbed-down mode of the grunting savage, and it's really incongruous today to see this because it comes across as dumb, uneducated, ignorant. At the time, the notion was that it came across as innocent and pure.
Thank you for protecting me.
Me?
I said, thank you for protecting me.
Me?
No. I'm only me for me.
Me?
No. To you, I'm you.
You?
No. I'm Jane Parker. Understand? Jane. Jane.
Jane.
Jane.
Jane.
Yes, Jane. You? Jane.
Jane.
And you?
Jane is one of the most famous phrases in film lexicon, but this is never actually spoken on the film. And there are a variety of theories of how this came into our popular vernacular. In a June 1932 Photoplay magazine article, Johnny Weissmuller, joking about how little dialogue he had, said, "Me, Tarzan, you, Jane," was sort of the extent of it. And so it's possible that that early interview, just weeks after the film opened, is the source of it. Another story, after shooting one day, Maureen O'Sullivan was trying to lift a heavy trunk into the boot of her car, and Johnny happened along and just with one arm swung this thing into her car and laughed and said, "Me Tarzan, you Jane." There's another story. They were in between shots filming, and he and Maureen were up in the tree, and Johnny started bouncing up and down on the branch. And when Maureen screamed, thinking she was going to fall out, Johnny just laughed and said, "Me Tarzan, you Jane."
They tried different things to make Jane look pretty sexy. And first of all, they had the idea of wearing no bra, no brassiere at all, and that she would be always covered with a branch, and they tried that, and that didn't work. So then they made a costume, and it wasn't that bad at all. There was a little leather bra and a thing, and the letters just came in. So it added up like to thousands of women who were objecting to my costume. And I think that was one of the things that started the Legion of Decency. It's funny, you know. We were unreal people, and yet we were real.
Beyond the poetic and adventurous nature of the first two films, and beyond their masterful directing, they do have a strong sense of eroticism, which completely disappeared when the Hays Code was established. There's obviously a strong sexual tension between the two characters, who are practically naked. They're only wearing this fine belt with a piece of leather hanging off the front and the back, leaving their thighs completely exposed. Then, when the Hays Code was established, from the third film onwards, the characters begin looking like they're wearing baby diapers. They're dressed from the knee and all the way up to the chest. The outfit also served to hide Johnny Weissmuller's potbelly when he gained weight. He did lose all his sex appeal. Then the child comes in, but obviously he's not born through childbirth. He falls from the sky because the code required characters to be married if they were to have a baby. There was also less violence and action, and eventually eroticism went away completely, which turned it into a sort of mainstream product suitable for all audiences. But this is actually the way all classical heroes evolved through the 20th century. Tarzan became the perfect example of the aseptic hero, but that's not the way Burroughs originally wrote him.
After the end of World War II, Tarzan would again be censored, this time in France, where Tarzan and his free lifestyle in the jungle was seen as an undesirable influence on young people who were avid readers of the Tarzan comics.
After the liberation of France in the late 1940s, there was a wave of protest against comic books from various interest groups. Tarzan was regularly criticized and labeled as a danger to youth. People thought that these comics would turn young readers into gangsters. A censorship committee was created, and the French authorities on the matter asked for Tarzan to stop. They sent a notice to the publisher. But Del Duca actually managed to resist the committee's demand by self-censoring just a few things. Some of Tarzan's nakedness as a child, for instance, or the characters called the Ononos, which were drawn by Bern Hogarth. They were essentially large heads without bodies. But in the French edition that was published, they looked more like pygmies. Despite all that, people voted for a law to go against comic books. And Tarzan would become one of the characters often cited by pressure groups. They were pushing for this law because they thought he was supposedly dangerous and harmful to young readers. This is an official paper issued by the Ministry of Justice in 1950, explaining why Tarzan is dangerous to young people. This document was sent to publishers to tell them what to publish or not to publish. Tarzan is listed as an affront to human dignity. saying, this type of character should be banned, firstly because young readers in general are likely to identify with the protagonists of the stories they read and model their behavior after them, and secondly because it is inappropriate for publications for youth, even non-educational ones, to idealize the triumph of physical strength and animality.
In
the mid-1950s, Tarzan largely disappeared from the French publishing scene. Del Duca issued one last farewell issue that was only 4 pages. There was one entire page of text entitled Farewell to Tarzan. It read, "To our dearest readers and their parents, we were notified that the Joint Commission for Publications and Press Agencies is revoking the registration certificate that authorized Tarzan to be published like any other youth periodical. From now on, Tarzan will be read all over the world except in France." This is 1952. And Tarzan's own publisher is the only one standing up for him. Bern Hogarth's style worked against Tarzan and had a negative impact on the way it was perceived in France. Teachers and critics condemned it to the point that they wanted it censored. Yet at the same time, it was Bern Hogarth's quality work that also led people to realize in the 1960s that comics could actually be a form of art. For a long time, comics were unfairly criticized. No one stood up for them. No intellectuals spoke up in the 1930s, 40s or 50s to say, let's stop saying outrageous things about Tarzan, because comics didn't have any cultural legitimacy. But in 1967, the Museum of Decorative Arts in Paris hosted a major exhibition dedicated to comics and narrative visuals. This exhibition featured, among other things, panels by Bern Hogarth that were enlarged to a scale of several meters. This enlargement of small drawings enabled visitors to fully appreciate the details and graphic qualities of the work.
In spite of local historical sensitivities such as this, the legend of Tarzan has always translated very well internationally, and the novels and films have been enormously popular around the world. Tarzan has been reimagined in Bollywood films, in China and Russia, even in contemporary Manhattan, and most recently at the height of colonialism in the Belgian Congo. The representation of Tarzan's body has been continually reinterpreted throughout his 100-year history. In 1893, Burroughs visited the Chicago World's Fair, where he witnessed firsthand the displays of muscularity and strength by the father of modern bodybuilding, Eugene Sandow, who measured his proportions against classical Greek and Roman statues. Sandow undoubtedly influenced Burroughs' descriptions of Tarzan's visible strength and many of the later representations of Tarzan in cinema, and especially the 1940s comics by artist Bern Hogarth. During the 1950s and 60s, the cinematic representation of Tarzan moved away from that of an accomplished athlete, as portrayed by Olympic swimmers Johnny Weissmuller and Buster Crabbe. Lex Barker was a handsome and more articulate Tarzan, while the casting of Gordon Scott was a return to the bodybuilder type. Producers Sol Lesser and Cy Weintraub also decided for the first time to film Tarzan on location in Africa, to add new authenticity to the jungle stories. However, the character of Jane increasingly disappeared in the stories, and Tarzan was now seen having individual adventures with the possibility of other romances.
I'll talk on it myself.
Even the very popular TV series in the mid-1960s starring Ron Ely did not feature Jane, who was absent from the screen until the MGM remake of Tarzan the Ape Man with Bo Derek in 1981. Jane again emerges as a strong character in the 1984 film Greystoke, The Legend of Tarzan, Lord of the Apes.
Welcome home, Lord Clayton.
This is Jane from America. He immediately trusts that person because she's pure, because her heart is pure, because her intention are pure. And he is the same. The difference is that She's coming from civilization and kept her purity as a human person. And he has no choice. He is pure no matter what. He's an animal. An animal is pure.
Christopher Lambert wasn't muscular when we met him, at all. But he had something else beside that. Because he was myopic, he wore glasses. And if you took the glasses off, somehow his myopic look was beyond, was to the horizon, was beyond anybody near. It was quite mesmerizing.
The figure of the male athlete playing Tarzan is circumscribed by a whole lot of dictates, really, around what is the popular iconic male body of the time, what is suitable for photographic pin-ups, what will appeal to the gaze of the camera and, if you like, the voyeuristic, erotic gaze of the audience. So he's got to meet a lot of criteria.
The role of Tarzan has frequently been very demanding for actors. As Ron Ely, Tarzan in the 1960s TV series describes,
big enough to be a male.
In the script, it said Tarzan and the tiger finally come face to face, and they fight. And they fight for a long time until both are exhausted, and then they look at each other with mutual respect, and then the tiger turns away from Tarzan and walks into the jungle, and Tarzan lets him go. It was mind-boggling. I fed him, I took him out there and connected him to the chain. And you release him from the chain, and you're in the midst of this thing, and it's just you and the tiger. But the tiger was content and happy. And there's one way that you make a cat attack you. And it's not something you want to do, but it's what you have to do, I guess, sometimes. You know, so I'd play with him. I'd kind of hit him on the nose. Not hard, just kind of. I love you, cat. So I knew if I turned my back on him and took a couple of running steps, he'd attack me. So I went through every other option I had. So I said, let's go, roll away. And all the cameras started. Everybody up, 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 up. Everybody replied. And so I turned around and took off. That's all I heard, just that. When I turned around, this cat was above me in the air, and I'm tall, coming out of my ears, out of one eye. I was exhausted. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't lift my arms. And the cat kind of looked at me like, oh, well, I've had enough of you. And he turned around and walked off and went over to the tree.
It's impossible to bring real animals into these situations. One is it's ethically not right. The philosophy of the movie would be completely compromised if we brought a real animal onto a film set and tried to coerce it into doing something we wanted it to do. It's completely not what the ethics of the film have at their heart. And also they would probably eat the actors. Margot, in that sequence where she suddenly runs into a sort of setting of Manjani females and she has to fall on her knees in the rain. We had guys there who were in these grayscale suits that she could work with and sort of look up to and have an eye line to.
We had to realistically make the whole ape colony become this sort of hybrid of ape. Today, it'll all be done by computers. The new Tarzan will produce extremely powerful and good reproductions of the ape population. We had to find human beings that were of a particular height, never too high, about 5'5" was maximum, and a lot of them were dancers, and we put them through a training of about 6 months, I suppose, to be an ape troupe with the whole hierarchy of the ape, the alpha male, the females, the babies, and the only real animals we used were the little baby chimpanzees. They weren't
gymnastic and stuff like that, and then 4 hours a day of chimping, because what was really important.
1872 publication, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, where he talks about the way the emotions evolve in the grief, anger, despair, happiness, and so on. And certainly it's very relevant for the Tarzan movies, where We see Tarzan in intimacy and companionship with his favourite animal. Greystoke himself, when he's taken back to London to claim his inheritance as Lord Greystoke, and discovers in the laboratory there one of the apes who I think is his father, who brought him up in a cage to be experimented on, and his fury is he sets him free.
When Tarzan goes back to the jungle and he gradually enters back into the forest and you lose sight of him in the forest, that to me is a quintessential Tarzan moment.
Hudson's film presents the idea of a renaissance. The civilization that we were caught up in is gone, or is at least heading that way. Man can only rediscover himself if he embraces nature once again.
In some ways, Tarzan is also a normal man. He's truly sensitive to the world. He's sensitive to his animal family. He's sensitive to his human family. He's sensitive to nature. He knows that balance can be found in this natural world. And he says it himself. He feels much better, more peaceful, and less threatened in the jungle than in the streets of Chicago or in Victorian England.
And it's the natural world that exists. It's not hundreds of millions of miles away in a different universe. It's here on this planet. And I think what he reminds us of is how beautiful this world in which we live is.
He's a hero for all ages, for all times. And that was the genius of Edgar Rice Burroughs.
The legend of Tarzan may be over 100 years old now, but he continues to be reimagined and reinterpreted with each generation and in various cultural contexts around the globe. Tarzan is able to thrive in the natural world and to act with savagery if he has to, and he fundamentally rejects the hypocrisy of the so-called civilized world. His instinctive understanding of the animals and plants in his natural environment makes him more relevant today than at any time in the history of the legend.
Not a bit afraid, not a bit sorry.
And his love for Jane in their Garden of Eden is continually a powerful reminder that money and material things will never buy true happiness.
I feel.
Tarzan of the Apes, brought to you from out the pages of Edgar Rice Burroughs' gripping book. Now, are you ready? Hold your breath! Almost silently, the ape man swings through the trees toward Turcos and his prey. Turcos' keen ears catch the faint sound of pursuit. At last overtaken, he drops